My name is Detective Mike Harrison, and I've been working the streets of Chicago for 15 years. I thought I'd seen everything until that night in October, when my phone rang at 3:33 a.m. The caller ID showed a number I recognized from the case files. It belonged to Marcus Thompson, a construction worker who'd been found dead in his apartment 3 days earlier. We'd just buried him that afternoon. I stared at the phone, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a family member using his phone, or a technical glitch. But something in my gut told me to answer. When I picked up, the voice on the other end was weak, raspy, but unmistakably Marcus. He said my name, then whispered something that made my blood run cold. He told me he wasn't dead, that someone had drugged him to fake his death, and that he'd been buried alive. But that wasn't the worst part. He said he could hear digging above him, and voices he recognized. Someone was coming for him, but not to rescue him. They were coming to make sure he stayed dead permanently. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there in my patrol car, hands shaking, trying to process what I'd just heard. Every rational part of my brain said it was impossible. I'd seen the body myself. I'd attended the funeral. But 15 years on the force had taught me to trust my instincts, and something about that call felt terrifyingly real. I'd worked Marcus's case personally. He'd been found in his apartment by his landlord after neighbors complained about a smell. The coroner had ruled it a heart attack, nothing suspicious. Marcus was only 34, but he'd had a history of drug use, and his lifestyle wasn't exactly healthy. The case had been closed within 48 hours. Now, sitting in my car at 3 in the morning, I was questioning everything. How could a dead man make a phone call? How could someone fake death convincingly enough to fool a medical examiner? And why would anyone go to such elaborate lengths to kill a construction worker? Marcus wasn't wealthy, wasn't involved in anything criminal as far as we knew. He was just a regular guy, trying to make ends meet. But as I thought back to the investigation, I started remembering details that hadn't seemed important at the time. The apartment had been unusually clean for someone who'd supposedly died of natural causes. There had been no signs of struggle, no indication that Marcus had felt sick or called for help. His phone had been placed neatly on the nightstand, fully charged. His wallet and keys were arranged perfectly on the kitchen counter. For someone who'd supposedly had a sudden heart attack, everything had been remarkably organized. The more I thought about it, the more suspicious it all seemed. Marcus's medical history showed some drug use, but nothing that would indicate an imminent heart attack. His last known activities had been completely normal. He'd worked his shift, stopped at a grocery store, and gone home. There were no signs of distress, no calls to emergency services, no attempts to contact family or friends. It was as if he'd simply laid down and died, which was possible, but statistically unlikely for someone his age. I'd also noticed during the investigation that Marcus's apartment had been unusually secure. All the windows were locked from the inside, the door had multiple deadbolts, and there was a security camera system that had mysteriously malfunctioned the night he died. At the time, I'd attributed it to paranoia, or perhaps previous break-ins. But now I wondered if Marcus had been afraid of something, or someone specific. I called my partner, Detective Sarah Chen, and told her about the call. She thought I was losing it, but she'd worked with me long enough to know I didn't make things up. We decided to drive to Greenwood Cemetery, where Marcus had been buried earlier that day. The place was eerily quiet, fog rolling between the headstones like something out of a horror movie. We parked near the fresh grave and grabbed our flashlights. As we approached Marcus's burial site, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The earth around the grave looked disturbed, not just from the burial, but as if someone had been digging recently. There were fresh footprints in the mud, and tire tracks that didn't match the funeral home's vehicles. Sarah knelt down and examined the soil. She found something that changed everything. A small piece of PVC pipe sticking out of the ground near the headstone. It was barely visible, hidden behind some flowers. When we looked closer, we realized it was an air tube, crudely installed, but functional. Someone had prepared for this. Someone had planned for Marcus to be buried alive. We called for backup and an excavation team, but as we waited, my phone rang again. Same number, same impossible caller. This time, Marcus's voice was even weaker. He told me they were almost through the coffin lid, and he could see flashlight beams. He begged me to hurry, then said something that made my blood freeze. "Detective Harrison, they know you're here. They're watching you right now." I started thinking about the funeral earlier that day. It had been a small service, just a few family members and some coworkers from the construction company. But now I remembered seeing some faces that hadn't belonged. Men in dark suits who'd stood at the back of the chapel, not participating in the service, but watching everything carefully. At the time, I'd assumed they were from the construction company's insurance department, or maybe distant relatives. But thinking back, their behavior had been odd. They'd left before the burial, and they'd been more interested in watching the attendees than paying respects to Marcus. I'd also noticed a black SUV in the cemetery parking lot that had seemed out of place. It had tinted windows and no visible license plate from where I'd been standing. The driver had stayed in the vehicle throughout the entire burial service. I'd made a mental note to check it out, but then I'd gotten distracted by other cases and forgotten about it. Now I was wondering if that SUV had been part of whatever was happening to Marcus. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Marcus's death had been staged from the beginning. But why? What could a construction worker have possibly known or seen that would warrant such an elaborate deception? During the funeral service, I'd also noticed that Marcus's family seemed unusually nervous. His sister had been constantly looking around, as if she expected trouble. His mother had asked me several times if I was sure the investigation was complete. If there was any possibility that Marcus's death wasn't natural. At the time, I'd attributed their behavior to grief and the shock of losing a young family member. But now I wondered if they'd known something was wrong, if Marcus had confided in them about threats or suspicious activities he'd witnessed. I spun around, scanning the cemetery with my flashlight, but saw nothing except shadows and tombstones. Sarah had her weapon drawn, moving in a defensive pattern we'd practiced countless times. The backup units were still 10 minutes out, and I could hear the sound of digging coming from beneath our feet. It was faint, but definitely there. Someone was working to get into that coffin, and it wasn't a rescue operation. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus's number, northwest corner, behind the mausoleum. 3 men, 1 has a badge. My heart sank. A cop was involved in this. Sarah and I moved carefully toward the northwest section of the cemetery, using the larger monuments for cover. As we got closer, I could see the glow of flashlights and hear muffled voices. 3 figures were huddled around what looked like a portable drilling device. One of them was definitely wearing a police uniform. I couldn't make out faces in the darkness, but the body language was all wrong. These weren't cops conducting a legitimate investigation. They were moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before. Sarah positioned herself behind a large angel statue, while I tried to get a better angle. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The cop wasn't just any officer. It was Lieutenant Rodriguez from our own precinct, a man I'd worked with for over a decade, a man I'd trusted with my life. He was directing the other 2 men, pointing toward different sections of the grave. They weren't trying to rescue Marcus. They were trying to eliminate him permanently. Rodriguez had been my training officer when I'd first joined the force. He'd taught me everything I knew about police work, about reading people, about surviving on the streets. He'd been at my wedding, had helped me through my divorce, had been there when my father died. Seeing him here, in the middle of the night, directing what was clearly a murder operation, felt like being punched in the gut. I thought about all the cases we'd worked together, All the times he'd vouched for me with the brass, all the advice he'd given me about navigating department politics. How long had he been corrupt? How many other cases had been compromised? How many other people had died because of decisions he'd made? I realized I was looking at the destruction of everything I'd believed about the job, about the people I worked with, about the system I'd dedicated my life to serving. The two men with Rodriguez were clearly professionals. They moved with military precision. Their equipment was top grade, and they communicated with hand signals rather than words. This wasn't some desperate improvisation. This was a well-planned operation carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing. I watched as they continued their work, using specialized tools to access the coffin without disturbing too much of the surrounding earth. They were trying to make it look like a routine grave maintenance or investigation, something that wouldn't attract attention if discovered later. The level of planning and preparation suggested that this wasn't their first time doing something like this. How many other graves and how many other cemeteries contained victims of similar operations? I radioed for additional backup, specifically requesting units from outside our precinct. If Rodriguez was involved, I couldn't trust anyone from our department. Sarah and I watched as the three men continued their work. They'd brought professional equipment, a silent drill, portable lights, and what looked like medical supplies. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment operation. They'd planned this carefully. My phone vibrated again. Another text from Marcus. There through the lid. I can see them. Rodriguez is telling them to make it look like a heart attack. They have a syringe. I realized we were running out of time. Marcus was about to be murdered, and we were outnumbered and outgunned. But I couldn't let an innocent man die, especially not at the hands of a corrupt cop. I made a decision that would either save Marcus's life or end my career. I called out Rodriguez's name and stepped into the open, my weapon drawn. The three men froze, caught in the act. Rodriguez slowly turned round, his face a mask of surprise and calculation. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Rodriguez smiled. That same friendly smile I'd seen in the break room 1,000 times. He said my name like we were old friends meeting for coffee. But his hand was moving toward his weapon, and I knew this was about to go very wrong, very quickly. The other two men scattered, disappearing into the darkness between the tombstones. Rodriguez and I stood facing each other across Marcus's grave, two cops who'd once been partners, now on opposite sides of something much bigger than either of us had imagined. I could see Rodriguez's mind working, calculating his options. He was a smart man, a good cop, when he wasn't being a corrupt one. He knew the situation was bad, but he also knew that I was alone, and that backup was still several minutes away. He started talking, using that calm, reasonable voice he'd always used when interrogating suspects. He told me I didn't understand what was happening, that this was bigger than just one case, that there were forces at work that I couldn't comprehend. He said Marcus had gotten involved in something dangerous, something that threatened a lot of good people, and that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good. It was the same justification I'd heard from corrupt cops throughout my career, the same rationalization that allowed good people to do terrible things. Rodriguez explained that Marcus had witnessed something he shouldn't have, something that could destroy the lives and careers of dozens of police officers and their families. He claimed that faking Marcus's death had been a mercy, a way to protect him from people who would have killed him much more brutally. But I could hear the lies in his voice, could see the calculation behind his eyes. Rodriguez wasn't trying to protect Marcus. He was trying to protect himself and whatever criminal enterprise he'd become involved in. The elaborate nature of the fake death scheme, the professional equipment, the coordinated operation, it all pointed to something much larger and more organized than a simple cover-up. Rodriguez kept his hands visible, but I could see him calculating his options. He started talking, trying to explain how this wasn't what it looked like, how Marcus had gotten involved with some dangerous people, and this was the only way to protect him. But I could hear the lies in his voice, the same tone he'd used when testifying in court about suspects who'd mysteriously confessed after private interrogations. Sarah had flanked around behind him, her weapon trained on his back. The backup units were getting closer. I could hear sirens in the distance. Rodriguez heard them too, and his demeanor changed. The friendly mask slipped away, replaced by something cold and calculating. He told me I didn't understand what I was interfering with, that Marcus had seen something he shouldn't have seen, and that keeping him alive would put a lot of good cops in danger. That's when I realized this wasn't just about one corrupt officer. This was about a whole network, a conspiracy that went deeper than I'd imagined. Rodriguez made his move, diving toward his weapon while shouting for his accomplices to return. Sarah fired a warning shot, but Rodriguez was already rolling behind a large headstone. Gunfire erupted across the cemetery, muzzle flashes lighting up the fog like deadly fireworks. I dropped into the grave, using my flashlight to locate Marcus. He was there, barely conscious, but alive, lying in a coffin that had been modified, with air holes and a false bottom. Someone had planned this very carefully, but they'd also planned for him to survive long enough to be eliminated properly. As I helped Marcus out of the coffin, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. His eyes were wide with terror, but also with determination. He whispered something that made everything click into place. The warehouse on 5th Street. There, moving everything tonight. Rodriguez said they had to clean house before the federal investigation starts. I realized that Marcus hadn't just witnessed something random. He'd stumbled onto a major operation, something big enough to warrant federal attention. The fake death, the elaborate burial scheme, the involvement of multiple officers, it all made sense now. They weren't just trying to silence one witness. They were trying to eliminate evidence before a much larger investigation could uncover their activities. Marcus was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, and his death was supposed to be the final step in covering their tracks. The federal investigation he'd mentioned explained the urgency of the operation. Someone had tipped off the corrupt officers that they were under scrutiny, and they were desperately trying to eliminate any evidence that could be used against them. Marcus told me more as we crouched in the grave, gunfire continuing above us. 3 weeks earlier, while working a late shift at a construction site downtown, he'd seen Rodriguez and several other officers moving large duffel bags from a police van into a building that was supposed to be empty. The building was directly across from his work site, giving him a perfect view of the loading dock. He'd watched for over an hour as uniformed officers had transferred bag after bag from police vehicles into the warehouse. Some of the bags had been evidence bags, the kind used to store confiscated drugs and money. Others had been unmarked duffel bags that could have contained anything. Marcus had recognized several of the officers, including Rodriguez and 2 sergeants from the narcotics division. He'd also seen a man in an expensive suit who'd been directing the operation. Someone who clearly wasn't a cop, but who was obviously in charge. I pulled Marcus out of the coffin as gunfire continued above us. He was weak but coherent enough to tell me what he'd witnessed. When he'd tried to report what he'd seen through proper channels, he'd been told that the operation was classified and that he should forget about it. But Marcus wasn't the kind of person who could ignore what he'd witnessed. He'd started asking questions, trying to find out more about the building and the shell company that owned it. A few days later, he'd started receiving threats. Then someone had broken into his apartment and injected him with something that had made him appear dead. He'd been conscious during his own funeral, unable to move or speak, listening to people talk about him in the past tense. The backup units had arrived, and the gunfire was intensifying. Sarah was coordinating with the arriving officers, trying to explain the situation without knowing who else might be compromised. I helped Marcus climb out of the grave, supporting his weight as we moved toward the patrol cars. That's when I saw Rodriguez making a run for the cemetery's back exit. He was heading for a black SUV that hadn't been there when we'd arrived. I realized his accomplices had been planning an escape route all along. I made another split-second decision that would haunt me for months afterward. I left Marcus with the arriving officers and pursued Rodriguez on foot. I couldn't let him escape, not when he might be the key to unraveling a corruption scandal that could destroy the entire department. But as I chased him through the fog-shrouded cemetery, I began to understand that I was in way over my head. Marcus had given me more details during our brief conversation in the grave. The building he'd seen the officers entering was owned by a shell company that had connections to several major drug trafficking organizations. The construction site where he'd been working was part of a larger development project that would eventually include luxury condominiums and commercial space. But for now, it provided the perfect vantage point for observing illegal activities in the warehouse across the street. Marcus had recognized several of the officers involved in the operation. Besides Rodriguez, he'd seen Sergeant Williams from the narcotics unit, Detective Foster from robbery homicide, and at least 3 patrol officers whose names he didn't know but whose faces he recognized from the precinct. The man in the expensive suit had been giving orders to all of them, treating the police officers like employees rather than law enforcement officials. The operation had been running for several hours, with multiple trips between the police vehicles and the warehouse. Marcus estimated that they'd moved at least 50 bags of various sizes, some small enough to contain cash or drugs, others large, enough to hold weapons or other contraband. The level of organization and the number of people involved suggested that this wasn't a one-time event, but part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. I caught up with Rodriguez at the cemetery's back gate. He was fumbling with keys, trying to unlock a chain that secured the exit. When he saw me approaching, he turned with his weapon drawn. For a moment, we stood facing each other in the pale moonlight. 2 cops who'd shared countless shifts, now pointing guns at each other's hearts. Rodriguez started talking again, but this time he wasn't lying. He told me about a drug operation that had been running through the department for over 2 years, using police vehicles and evidence rooms to move product throughout the city. He said Marcus had stumbled onto something that could bring down 20 officers and destroy dozens of families. He claimed he'd been trying to protect everyone by staging Marcus's death and relocating him somewhere safe. But I could see the truth in his eyes. There was no relocation plan. There was only elimination. The sirens were getting closer, and Rodriguez was running out of time. He made me an offer. Walk away, forget what I'd seen, and he'd make sure I was taken care of financially for the rest of my career. He said the corruption went all the way to the top, and that fighting it would only destroy my life and accomplish nothing. For a moment, I actually considered it. 15 years of seeing the worst of humanity had worn me down, and the idea of walking away from all of it was tempting. But then I thought about Marcus, lying in that coffin, listening to his own funeral. I thought about all the other victims who might be buried in graves throughout the city. People who'd seen too much and been silenced permanently. I told Rodriguez I couldn't do it. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer, and slowly lowered his weapon. Then he said something that still gives me nightmares. You have no idea how deep this goes, Mike. Arresting me won't stop anything. It'll just make you the next target. The backup units surrounded us before I could respond. Rodriguez surrendered without resistance, but as they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at me with something that might have been pity. Rodriguez had revealed more during our confrontation than he'd probably intended. The operation wasn't just about moving drugs. It was about controlling the entire supply chain in the city, from the street-level dealers all the way up to the major distributors. Corrupt cops were providing protection, eliminating competition, and ensuring that certain organizations could operate without interference. The evidence room thefts were just one part of it. They were also manipulating investigations, losing crucial evidence, and intimidating witnesses. The network had been operating for years, gradually expanding its influence and control. What had started as a few officers looking the other way for extra money had evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that touched every aspect of law enforcement in the city. They had people in patrol units, detective divisions, narcotics, internal affairs, and even the prosecutor's office. The level of corruption was so extensive that it would take years to fully uncover and prosecute. Rodriguez also revealed that Marcus wasn't the first person they'd eliminated using the fake death method. Over the past 3 years, at least 6 other witnesses had been silenced using similar techniques. The fake deaths had been so convincing that no one had ever investigated further. These people had been buried alive, left to suffocate in their coffins, while their families mourned above them. 6 months later, I learned he'd been right about one thing. This was just the beginning. The investigation that followed Marcus's rescue uncovered a corruption network that reached into every level of the Chicago Police Department. 23 officers were arrested, including 2 captains and a deputy chief. The federal task force that took over the case found evidence of drug trafficking, money laundering, witness intimidation, and murder. Marcus's testimony was crucial, but it came at a cost. He'd been placed in witness protection, but even that hadn't been enough to keep him completely safe. There had been 2 attempts on his life, both carried out by people with connections to the corrupt officers. The first attempt had occurred just 3 weeks after his rescue, when gunmen had tried to ambush him outside a safe house. The second attempt had been more sophisticated, involving a car bomb that had been discovered just minutes before it was set to detonate. The warehouse on 5th Street that Marcus had mentioned turned out to be the center of the entire operation. When federal agents raided it, they found over $50 million worth of drugs, cash, and stolen evidence. They also found detailed records of the corruption network, including payments to officers, schedules for evidence room thefts, and plans for eliminating witnesses. The man in the expensive suit that Marcus had seen was Vincent Caruso, a major drug distributor who'd been operating in Chicago for over a decade. Caruso had been paying corrupt cops to protect his operation, while using their resources to eliminate his competition. The arrangement had been incredibly profitable for everyone involved, which explained why so many officers had been willing to participate. But the investigation also revealed something even more disturbing. The corruption hadn't started with drugs. It had begun years earlier with small favors and minor rule bending. Officers had been gradually drawn into increasingly serious crimes, each step seeming reasonable at the time but ultimately leading to a point where they were trapped. Rodriguez himself had started by simply looking the other way when certain dealers operated in his district. Over time, he'd been asked to do more and more, until he was actively participating in murder plots. The psychological manipulation had been subtle but effective, turning good cops into criminals without them fully realizing what was happening. By the time they understood the scope of what they were involved in, they were too deep to get out. The network had used blackmail, threats, and financial incentives to ensure loyalty, creating a system where betrayal meant death. Many of the corrupt officers had families who were also threatened, making it even more difficult for them to break free from the criminal organization. The investigation revealed that the corruption network had been responsible for hundreds of crimes over the years, including dozens of murders that had been disguised as accidents, suicides, or natural deaths. They had manipulated crime statistics, destroyed evidence, intimidated witnesses, and perverted the course of justice in countless cases. The damage to the community's trust in law enforcement would take decades to repair. The trial of the corrupt officers became a media sensation. Every day brought new revelations about the extent of the corruption and the number of cases that had been compromised. Families of victims who'd been killed by the protected drug dealers filed lawsuits against the city. The police department's reputation was in ruins, and public trust in law enforcement had reached an all-time low. I testified for weeks, describing everything I'd witnessed that night in the cemetery and the investigation that had followed. The defense attorneys tried to paint me as an unreliable witness, suggesting that I'd imagined the phone calls from Marcus, or that I'd been part of the corruption myself. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The modified coffin, the air tube, the professional equipment found at the cemetery, it all supported Marcus's account of what had happened. Rodriguez was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he finally told the complete truth about the operation. He described how the corruption had started small and gradually expanded until it controlled significant portions of the city's drug trade. He named names, revealed bank account numbers, and provided details about murders that had been disguised as accidents or suicides. His testimony led to additional arrests and helped federal investigators understand the full scope of the criminal enterprise. But Rodriguez also revealed something that haunted me long after the trial ended. He told the court that Marcus hadn't been the first person they'd buried alive. Over the past 3 years, at least 6 other witnesses had been eliminated using similar methods. The fake deaths had been so convincing that no one had ever investigated further. These people had been buried alive, left to suffocate in their coffins while their families mourned above them. The thought of those victims dying alone in the darkness while their loved ones said goodbye was almost too much to bear. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the cases I'd worked, the deaths I'd investigated, the conclusions I'd reached. How many other murders had been disguised as natural deaths? How many families had buried empty coffins while their loved ones were killed elsewhere? The investigation had answered some questions, but it had raised many more. The corruption network had been dismantled, but the damage it had caused would last for generations. Trust in the police department would take years to rebuild, if it ever could be rebuilt at all. The federal investigation had also revealed connections between the Chicago corruption network and similar operations in other cities. The problem wasn't limited to one department or one city. It was a national issue that required a coordinated response from federal law enforcement agencies. Additional investigations were launched in Detroit, Cleveland, Miami, and Los Angeles, all based on information gathered from the Chicago case. The scope of police corruption across the country was much larger than anyone had imagined, affecting thousands of officers and compromising tens of thousands of criminal cases. The legal system would be dealing with the aftermath for decades to come. The aftermath of the investigation changed my life in ways I never could have anticipated. I was promoted to lieutenant and put in charge of a new internal affairs unit designed to prevent future corruption. But the promotion felt hollow, considering what it had cost to earn it. I'd lost faith in many of my colleagues and in the institution I'd served for 15 years. Every case I worked now carried the shadow of doubt. Every officer I met could potentially be corrupt. Every death I investigated might be a murder disguised as something else. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was also necessary. The corruption network had been more extensive than anyone had imagined, and there was no guarantee that all of it had been uncovered. Marcus eventually came out of witness protection and started a new life in another state. We stayed in touch, occasionally, but our conversations were always strained. He'd survived something that should have killed him, but the experience had left him changed. He suffered from severe PTSD and had difficulty trusting anyone in law enforcement. He'd become a different person, harder and more suspicious, constantly looking over his shoulder for threats that might or might not be there. In many ways, the corrupt officers had succeeded in destroying his life, even though they'd failed to kill him. The cemetery where Marcus had been buried became a crime scene that was studied by law enforcement agencies around the world. The modified coffin and air tube system became evidence of how sophisticated criminal organizations could become when they had access to police resources and expertise. The case was taught in police academies as an example of how corruption could spread and how important it was to maintain ethical standards, even in difficult circumstances. But for me, the cemetery remained a place of nightmares. I drove past it occasionally, usually late at night, when I couldn't sleep. The fog still rolled between the headstones, and the shadows still seemed to hide secrets. I thought about all the people buried there, wondering how many of them had died natural deaths, and how many had been victims of crimes that were never investigated. The case had taught me that death wasn't always what it seemed, that even the most final act could be manipulated by people with enough power and resources. My personal relationships suffered as well. My marriage, which had already been strained by the demands of police work, finally ended in divorce. My ex-wife said she couldn't handle the constant stress and paranoia that had become part of my daily life. My children, who had once been proud of their father, the police officer, now seemed embarrassed by my profession and the negative publicity that surrounded it. 5 years after that night, I received another phone call at 3:33 a.m. This time, the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. It was Rodriguez, calling from prison. He told me that the corruption network hadn't been completely destroyed, that there were still people out there who'd been part of the original operation. He said they were planning something big, something that would make the previous crimes look small by comparison. He offered to help me stop them, but only if I could guarantee his safety and a reduced sentence. I listened to his proposal, but I didn't trust him. Rodriguez had proven that he was willing to say anything to save himself, and I couldn't risk being manipulated again. But his call reminded me that the fight against corruption was never really over, that there would always be people willing to abuse their power for personal gain. 2 years later, Rodriguez's warning proved to be accurate. A new corruption scandal emerged, this one involving officers from multiple precincts and federal agencies. The investigation revealed that some members of the original network had escaped detection and had been rebuilding their operation from prison. They'd been using coded messages, corrupt guards, and outside contacts to coordinate a new criminal enterprise that was even more sophisticated than the first one. This time, they weren't just moving drugs. They were involved in human trafficking, arms dealing, and cybercrime. The scope of their activities crossed state lines and international borders, making it a federal priority that attracted attention from the highest levels of government. I was asked to join the federal task force investigating the new network, partly because of my experience with the original case, and partly because I was one of the few officers who'd proven to be completely clean. The work was dangerous and emotionally draining, but it was also necessary. We discovered that the corruption problem in law enforcement was much more widespread than anyone had realized, affecting departments in dozens of cities across the country. The investigation took 3 years and resulted in over 200 arrests. We found evidence of corruption networks in police departments, sheriff's offices, federal agencies, and even military units. The criminals had been recruiting officers systematically, targeting those who were vulnerable due to financial problems, personal issues, or career frustrations. They'd developed sophisticated methods for identifying potential recruits and gradually drawing them into criminal activities. The psychological manipulation techniques they used were similar to those employed by terrorist organizations and cults, designed to break down moral resistance and create loyalty to the criminal group rather than to law enforcement agencies. Marcus Thompson played a crucial role in the new investigation as well. His experience with the original network had given him insights into how these organizations operated, and his testimony helped prosecutors understand the methods used to recruit and control corrupt officers. He'd overcome much of his PTSD and had become an advocate for police reform and witness protection programs. His story had been featured in documentaries and news programs, helping to educate the public about the dangers of police corruption and the importance of protecting whistleblowers. The new investigation also revealed the fate of the other victims Rodriguez had mentioned during his trial. We found evidence of at least 12 people who'd been murdered using the fake death method, their bodies buried in cemeteries across the Midwest. Most of them had been witnesses to criminal activities, but some had been family members of people who'd refused to cooperate with the corruption network. The discovery of these additional victims led to new charges against surviving members of the original network, and provided closure for families who'd never understood what had happened to their loved ones. Each case was heartbreaking in its own way. Families who had grieved for years, believing their loved ones had died of natural causes, suddenly learned that they had been murdered in the most cruel and calculated way imaginable. The executions were traumatic for everyone involved. Forensic experts had to carefully examine each body to determine the cause of death and gather evidence that could be used in court. In several cases, they found clear signs that the victims had been buried alive, including scratches on the inside of coffin lids and evidence of desperate attempts to escape. Marcus worked closely with the families of these victims, helping them understand what had happened and supporting them through the legal process. His own experience gave him a unique perspective on their pain and trauma. He became a powerful advocate for victims' rights and helped establish support groups for families affected by police corruption. The psychological impact of learning that a loved one had been murdered in such a horrific way was devastating for many families. Some required extensive counseling and therapy to cope with the revelation. Others channeled their anger and grief into activism, working to reform law enforcement and prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The scope of the corruption uncovered in these investigations led to comprehensive reforms in law enforcement agencies across the country. New oversight mechanisms were established, including independent review boards and federal monitoring of police departments with histories of corruption. Training programs were developed to help officers recognize and resist recruitment attempts by criminal organizations. Psychological screening procedures were enhanced to identify officers who might be vulnerable to corruption, and support systems were established to help officers deal with financial and personal problems that could make them targets for criminal recruitment. Whistleblower protection programs were strengthened, and anonymous reporting systems were implemented to make it easier for officers to report suspected corruption without fear of retaliation. The technology used to monitor police activities was also upgraded. Body cameras became mandatory for all patrol officers, and GPS tracking systems were installed in all police vehicles. Evidence rooms were equipped with advanced security systems, and strict protocols were established for handling and storing confiscated materials. Despite these reforms, the fight against corruption remained an ongoing challenge. New cases emerged regularly, and new methods of corruption were constantly being developed by criminal organizations. The investigation had shown that corruption was not just a problem of individual bad actors, but a systemic issue that required constant vigilance and ongoing reform efforts. The financial cost of the corruption and the subsequent investigations was enormous. The city of Chicago paid out hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements to victims and their families. The federal government spent additional millions on investigations and prosecutions, but the real cost was measured in lost lives and destroyed trust in law enforcement. Communities that had been served by corrupt officers struggled to rebuild their relationship with police. Crime rates increased in some areas as residents became reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement. It would take years, perhaps decades, to fully restore public confidence in the police. The final chapter of this story is still being written. The investigation into police corruption continues, led by a joint task force that includes federal agents, state investigators, and carefully vetted local officers. New cases are discovered regularly, and new networks are uncovered with disturbing frequency. The problem is larger and more persistent than anyone had imagined, requiring constant vigilance and ongoing reform efforts. I'm now the chief of police, in a small city outside Chicago, trying to implement the lessons I learned from the Marcus Thompson case. We've established strict oversight procedures, regular integrity testing, and comprehensive background checks for all officers. We've also created anonymous reporting systems and witness protection protocols designed to encourage people to come forward when they witness wrongdoing. The work is challenging, but it's also rewarding. Every day that passes without a corruption scandal is a victory. Every officer who maintains their integrity despite temptation is a success story. But I know that the fight is never really over, that there will always be people willing to abuse their power and others willing to look the other way. The phone call that started this entire saga still haunts my dreams. Sometimes I wake up at 3:33 a.m., expecting to hear Marcus's voice on the other end of the line. The memory of that night in the cemetery, of seeing Rodriguez with a gun in his hand, of pulling Marcus out of that modified coffin, remains as vivid as if it happened yesterday. The case changed everything I thought I knew about police work, and about the people I'd trusted with my life. It taught me that corruption could happen anywhere, to anyone, and that the price of integrity was constant vigilance. Marcus Thompson survived something that should have killed him, and his survival exposed a criminal network that had operated in plain sight for years. His courage in coming forward, despite the personal cost, helped save countless lives and restore some measure of integrity to law enforcement. But the story isn't really about Marcus or about me, or even about the corrupt officers who were brought to justice. It's about the ongoing struggle between good and evil that plays out every day in police departments across the country. It's about the choice that every officer makes between serving the public and serving themselves, between upholding the law and breaking it for personal gain. The badge represents authority and responsibility, but it also represents temptation and opportunity. The difference between a good cop and a corrupt one often comes down to a single moment, a single decision, a single choice between right and wrong. The Marcus Thompson case reminded me why I became a police officer in the first place: to protect people who can't protect themselves, to seek justice for victims who have no voice, and to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. It's not always easy work, and it's not always rewarding, but it's necessary work. And as long as there are people like Marcus Thompson willing to speak the truth despite the consequences, there's hope that integrity can prevail over corruption, that justice can triumph over crime, and that the badge can continue to represent something worth believing in. The fight continues, one case at a time, one officer at a time, one choice at a time.